The 1977 Formula One World Championship set the tone for the future of racing for many years to come. It was in this season that Lotus entered the racetracks, using the ground effect principle, and Renault with a turbo engine. And it was these two innovations that became the main components of victory in F1 for many years, disappearing from the world of Grand Prix only as a result of the ban, respectively in 1983 and 1989. Well, the end of the 70s was marked in Formula One by the beginning of the decline of the recently invincible Ken Tyrrell team, the debut of incredible Gilles Villeneuve, and the champion title of Jody Scheckter. Season 77 began with sensations that F1 hasn't known before or since. Jody Scheckter brought the Wolf team debut in the championship to victory in the very first race. Of course, before the start of the season, the chances of the stable of the millionaire Walter Wolf were regarded quite high, because the Canadian managed to gather a very strong team under his banner. But still, Wolf wasn't considered among the favorites of the season. However, the light inshore chassis designed by Harvard Postlethwaite proved so successful that, having climbed to the podium 5 times in the first 6 races, Scheckter sensationally led the championship. However, it was at this moment that luck turned away from Wolf, and the expected favorites came to the forefront. Needless to say, first of all, Ferrari was among those. In fact, the Italians had only one big point: the situation within the team. Very many in Scuderia disapproved of the act of Niki, who voluntarily stopped racing during the 76 Japanese Grand Prix and thus gave the title to James Hunt. In addition, in the team and outside it, they doubted that after last year's accident in the Nürburgring, the Austrian would be able to show the same speed. And the Ferrari even offered him a job as a technical consultant to keep him from going over to the competition. As a result, Lauda signed a contract as a second driver for Scuderia. The first was Carlos Reitman, who moved from Brabham. It must be said that the relation between the drivers didn't work out from the very beginning, and during the season, Niki at the slightest opportunity demonstrated to the first number of the team the real alignment of forces on the track. Unlike in previous years, Mauro Fornini didn't design a new car, so the driver started on only a slightly updated Ferrari 312 T2. The didn't hurry with the debut of the new model in McLaren either. After Hunt's victory in the 76 championship, Teddy Meyer thought that the far from new M23, created in 1973, would still be able to show itself, but he was mistaken. In the first half of the championship, Hunt and Joachim Mas were only able to get to the podium once. Without exaggeration, the new Lotus 78 became the technical sensation of the season, once again confirming the unique engineering and technical talent of Colin Chapman. The Briton has found both a simple and elegant way to increase downforce. In the second half of the 70s, aerodynamics became the recipe for success, and the designers tried in any way to increase the force with which the oncoming airflow presses the car to the track. Champion reasoned simply: why increase the pressure from above if you can reduce it from below? To do this, the Lotus 78 received a profiled bottom. Air getting into narrow channels increased the speed of the flow, as a result of which its pressure dropped. The car was equipped with elastic skirt along the edges of the side pontoons, which didn't allow outside air to pass under the bottom of the car. Lotus 78 seemed to stick to the track, compared to rivals' downforce increased by 15%. The development of the novelty was carried out by Tony Rudd and Peter Wright, who had already experimented with aerodynamics at BRM in the early 70s, but then didn't succeed. For more than 400 hours, engineers blew mock-ups of the future Lotus in the wind tunnel, and in the fall of 1976, the car entered the test tracks. But its genuine World Cup racing took place only at the 1977 Argentine Grand Prix, and at the 10th Grand Prix, the Renault car debuted, equipped with a 1.5-liter 6-cylinder V-shaped turbo engine. It must be said that since 1966 the F1 rules have spelled out the possibility of using engines equipped with a turbocharger. The formula features half of nature's Ferrari engine, but before that none of the engine builders was standing by it. And looking at Renault debut at British Grand Prix, it might seem that the French are just throwing money away over and over again. Jean-Pierre Jabay had to return to the pits after another breakdown. Sharp-tongued fans immediately nicknamed the car the Yellow Teapot for the color and the smoke that sometimes followed behind. The Frenchman, nevertheless, was able to get to the start, but already on the 16th lap he was forced to stop the race. The engine failed. The problem of reliability has become a real headache for Renault. For the first time the car was able to reach the finish line only almost a year after its debut. It's worth nothing another debutant of Grand Prix together with Renault, Michelin came to F1. The radial tires proposed by the French, they were 20% less than Goodyear diagonal tires and were much less prone to horizontal deformation in corners, gaining popularity much faster than turbo engines. The very next season at the Brazilian Grand Prix, Carlos Reutemann at Ferrari brought the first victory to Michelin. Well, Niki Lauda became the leader of the championship after the British Grand Prix. At the first stage of the season in South Africa, the Austrian scored perhaps the most important victory in his life, damaging the oil pipeline with the wreckage of Shadow Tom Price. The Welshman in this race became the victim of perhaps the most terrible and ridiculous accident in the history of F1, knocking down a fireman who ran across the track. The poor fellow died on the spot, and the fire extinguisher from his hands hit Price in the head. Lauda was able to contain all of Scheckter's attacks and finish first. The Austrian proved to all detractors that he can still win races. However, realizing that it would be extremely difficult for him to get ahead of the new Lotus on the track, the prudent Austrian chose a different tactic. In each race he thought firstly to reach the finish line without fail, and secondly to score the maximum possible number of points. Perhaps Niki wasn't always faster than his rivals, but only twice in a season he didn't see the checkered flag, and it was stability that allowed the Austrian to get a second championship title. Having become inaccessible to rivals 2 races before the end of the championship, Lauda, who no longer had to prove anything to anyone, left Ferrari. From the middle of the season, he was called by Bernie Ecclestone to join his team, and relations with Enzo Ferrari deteriorated by leaps and bounds. Gilles Villeneuve was invited to replace Lauda. In F1, the Canadian made his debut at the British Grand Prix driving McLaren. But Teddy Meyer made perhaps the most serious mistake in his life. He decided not to continue cooperation with the driver. And already in the second race for the stable from Maranello, Gilles had a serious accident with a tragic outcome. Due to brake failure, the Canadian ran into Ken Tyrrell, and, flying over the barrier, landing on spectators who made their way into the restricted area. 4 of them died, 5 were injured. Well, the championship ended perhaps only a little less sensational than it began. Jody Scheckter was ahead of Andretti on points and brought Wolves the vice championship title. The team of Colin Chapman, despite the 5 victories in the season, more than any of rivals, got only the silver of the Constructors' Championship. It's not surprising that the designers of the vast majority of teams spent the off-season trying to somehow change the design of cars to achieve a ground effect. But no one actually managed to do this, while alongside pontoons, like those of Lotus, preventing acceleration on straight lines. But the cars didn't want to stick to the track. Perhaps Ferrari and Brabham succumbed to the common passion a little less than the rest. The cars of the both teams had opposite 12-cylinder engines, which made it much more difficult to apply the ground effect, so both Mauro Fornieri and Gordon Murray chose a different path. The new Ferrari 312 T3 received a narrow and significantly forward cockpit, long but low pontoons. For this it was necessary to place the radiators almost horizontally and smoother contours, and the engine air intakes moved from the sides of the cockpit to the sloping top of the pontoons. All these changes pursued a goal that everyone somehow forgot about with the advent of the ground effect, a direct increase in downforce. Brabham BT46 was distinguished by an unusual cooling system. Permanent overheating of Alfa Romeo engine became one of the main problems for Bernie Ecclestone's team. Instead of the traditional radiator in the nose cone, Murray used several, mounted directly into the monocoque. This made it possible to make the nose of the car very flat. Another feature of the BT46 was the prototype of the current information display system. The racer could display data on the state of the engine and the time of the last lap on the dashboard. However, no one managed to fight on equal terms with Lotus in the 78 season. And although the new Ferrari leader Carlos Reitman won 2 of the first 4 races, and Mario Andretti and Nielsen replacement, Villeneuve was diagnosed with a malignant tumor in the fall, and the 29-year-old driver died a year later. Another sweet Ronnie Peterson only 3 times climbed to the top step of the podium. At the 6th stage of the championship in Belgium, Lotus 79 debuted, which showed the true alignment of forces. The car created by Martin Ogilvie, Wright was still involved in aerodynamics, was development of the 70F model. Without changing the general idea, this time attention was paid to the details. They moved the fuel tanks from the pontoons behind the driver's seat, moved the rear springs under the fairing so as not to disturb the airflow, and smoothed out the outlines of the car. As a result, its aerodynamic efficiency has increased significantly. In the next 4 races, Andretti and Peterson made 3 doubles and effectively removed the question of the championship winner. The only time the Lotus driver stumbled was in Sweden, when Andretti was unable to cope with Niki Lauda, who was driving the Brabham BT46B vacuum cleaner car. Gordon Murray, who had never been able to cool the Alfa Romeo engine sufficiently, used 2 small fans for this purpose at the Argentine Grand Prix. In the development of the idea, he decided to use one fan, but truly gigantic in size, more than ½ a meter in diameter. Mounted vertically, the fan was directly connected to the gearbox input shaft. It turned out that in addition to the task for which it was actually created, the unit also performs another one. It creates a vacuum under the bottom and sucks the car to the asphalt. A car equipped with a fan turned out to be extremely difficult to drive, since the rotational speed of the fan directly depended on the engine speed. Then, in the corners, the situation developed in a paradoxical way. If the car began to drift outwards, then the racers should not have let off their gas. This is elementary truth of racing, but on the contrary, increase the speed in order to the vacuum cleaner press the car against the canvas more strongly. Nevertheless, the advantages of the design turned out to be more significant than disadvantages, and Lauda won the first race on the BT46B. This victory was the first for the team since 1975 and for Alfa Romeo since 1951. It also turned out to be the last one after the Swedish Grand Prix. CIS, International Sports Commission FIA, banned the novelty as a movable aerodynamic device. The opinion of the drivers also affected here. The fact is that the racing vacuum cleaner collected dust and small pebbles from the surface of the track and spit out all this with force in the face of the pursuers. Thus, 3 races before the end of the season, Lotus became the owner of the Constructors' Championship, and Andretti's only rival in the fight for the title was his own teammate, Peterson. But, as has happened more than once in the history of F1, the triumph unexpectedly turned out into a tragedy. Due to a mistake by the starter judge, a blockage occurred in the first meters of the Italian Grand Prix, in which 12.5 cars participated, and it was Peterson who suffered the most. With burns and fractures on both legs, Scheckter was taken to one of the Milan hospitals. The operation was successful, and it seems that Ronnie's life was already out of danger. But the next day the racer died suddenly from a fat embolism. The body couldn't withstand the shocks, and the fat cells clogged the blood vessels. Of course, Peterson's death shows the war to Formula 1, but the reaction turned out to be obviously inadequate. Representatives of the GPDA Racing Trade Union accused Riccardo Patrese of the death of the Swede. The accident at the start really began with the fact that the Italian's errors hooked Hans McLaren and staged a real lynching for the young driver, without lengthy proceedings forbidding him to participate in the next race. For the errors team created only a year ago, however, this scandal wasn't the first. Even at the start of the championship, the head of the Shadow, Don Nichols, accused the designer of the errors, Tony Southgate, of plagiarism. The cars of the two teams actually differ only in colors, which is not surprising, because both were created by Southgate, who, gone to errors, took with him the drawings of the car. In the summer, a London court banned the use of errors FA1 in the races and ordered the team to transfer all cars and spare parts to the Shadow. But by that time, Southgate already managed to design a new car for the errors, and Patrese had already finished in the Swedish Grand Prix in the second position. But the drivers of the Shadow have never risen above 5th place during the season. Well, in the final 2 races of the Championship 78, the victories went to the Ferrari drivers, and on the new track in Montreal, Gilles Villeneuve climbed to the top step of the podium for the first time. But this only allowed Ferrari to get ahead of Brabham and take 2nd place in the Constructors' Championship, and Reitman, despite winning 4 Grand Prix, couldn't get ahead of Peterson on points. It was impossible to win F1 in the late 70s without using the ground effect. Even before the start of the Championship 79, in the world of Formula 1, serious battles began to boil. The first one unfolded on the federal front and became an echo of the future, heated battles between Jean-Marie Balestre and Bernie Ecclestone, and almost led to the disappearance of Formula 1. You can watch more about these events on my channel in the video -80s, the Battle for Golden Eggs. Now I'll just mention the moment that the reformed CIS, called FISA International Motorsports Federation, decided to ban the use of skirts in F1 cars. However, such a ban immediately crossed out the possibility of using the ground effect, and the Constructors Association, FOCA, resolutely started that it wouldn't comply with this requirement, since the design of the cars for the 79th season began a long time ago and it was too late to make such radical changes. The battle of the tire manufacturers also continued. I must say that after the appearance of the ground effect, an additional load fell on the tires. If earlier the centrifugal acceleration in corners was about 1.2 to 1.4 g, now the numbers have almost doubled. The situation here was clearly in favor of Michelin. The French worked with only two teams, Renault and Ferrari, while Goodyear had to take into account the request of a dozen and a half of teams. The first blow from Michelin was the introduction of super soft qualifying tires. The Americans fought off this attack not without grace. They chose a dozen of the strongest riders and began to provide specially designed tires only them. Everyone else had to be content with hard tires, which soon received the unflattering nickname wooden, and completely deprived the driver of the opportunity to compete for getting into the top 10 on the starting grid. As for technical innovation, the trends haven't changed here, alignment with Lotus. Moreover, if a year ago the designers tried more or less independently to tame the ground effect, now the Lotus 79 was unanimously chosen as an example to follow. The beautiful legend that Tyrrell's designers bought a build model of Holland's champion's creation, released by the Japanese company Tamiya, and based on it, they built their own car for the 79 season. However, this didn't help Ken Tyrrell's team much, which finished the season in 5th position, only one position below Lotus. The stable of Colin Chapman suffered both unexpected and devastating defeat, for which, however, one can find a very objective reason. Firstly, as soon as the 79th model won its first race, the designer's mind was already completely occupied with the new Lotus 80. It was assumed that the car would do without rear wings at all. The value of the front generally decreased significantly with the advent of the ground effect, and the role of the rear was supposed to be assigned on the continuation of the side pontoons, curving upwards. But this time, Chapman's traditionally innovative ideas turned out to be not so successful. There was not enough downforce, they had to return to the traditional rear wing, and as a result, Mario Andretti started racing on a new car only 3 times, and Reitman, who switched from Ferrari, preferred the whole season perform on the 79th model. But the main reason for the failures lay not even in this. In the 78th season, Lotus outplayed rivals primarily due to the hard work of aerodynamic engineers who took full advantage of the ground effect. Rivals also had to go to a variety of technical tricks, if not to catch up, then at least not too far behind the cars of Colin Chapman. Now, when every team had its own winning car, the previously unnoticeable innovation of the second plan that Lotus simply didn't have came to the fore. So, the victories in the 79 season were divided among themselves by Ferrari, Ligier and Williams, and the last 2 stables were among the leaders quite unexpectedly. Ligier team became the author of the first sensation of the championship. The rivals didn't have time to prepare the new novelties for the start of the season. In the first 2 races, the Ligier GS11 designed by Gerard Ducarouge earned 27 out of 30 possible points. This success was achieved thanks to a very rigid body, which made it possible to take full advantage of the ground effect, as well as a widespread use of titanium, which made it possible to lighten the car. However, the French failed to develop success. Firstly, in the summer the team embarked on not always successful experiments with flexible wings. And secondly, Patrick Depailler, who became the leader of the championship, had an accident while flying on a hang glider, and Jackie X, who replaced him, didn't manage to maintain the winning path. And, of course, the rivals of the French didn't sit idle. The new Ferrari 312 T4 debuted at the 3rd round of the season in South Africa. In order to at least partially compensate for the geometric shortcomings of boxer engine and use the ground effect with maximum efficiency, the managers from Renault made the new version of the engine as narrow as it possible. The chassis, on the other hand, turned out to be long and wide, with the cockpit strongly shifted forward, from which the car looked sprawling. The teapot of the novelty turned out to be even more successful than the Ligier. Gilles Villeneuve won the Miami and Long Beach races, with his new teammate Jody Scheckter finishing second both times. As the season picked up momentum, the number of contenders for the victory continued to grow. In Spain, the Williams FW07 created by Patrick Head made its debut. Like the Lotus engineers 2 years ago, Head focused on the aerodynamics of the car. It's not surprising that the FW07 turned out to be very similar to the Lotus 79. The team of Frank Williams in the last championship showed that they are getting closer to the leaders. In Watkins Glen, Jones finished second, and in just the season of 78, the Australian doubled the team's points reserve at once. Last but not least, such progress was made possible by the fact that for the first time in the history of the team's existence, it was possible to solve the problem of a chronic lack of funds. One of Frank's friends, who worked at the European office of the Saudi airline Fly Saudia, set him up with his boss, and soon huge stickers from several Arab sponsors, including technology company Tech, appeared on Williams cars. Unlike the cars of rivals, the FW07 failed to make itself known in very first races, but the second half of this championship was held with their almost total superiority. At Silverstone, Jones and Regazzoni opened the score with victories. The Australian brought Frank the first pole and confidently led the race, but retired due to the engine failure. The fallen Bonner was picked up by a Swiss and crossed the finish line first, and then it was the turn of Jones himself, who won 3 stages. But such a finishing spurt was too late. In Monza, 2 races before the end of the season, the Ferrari drivers gave their fans a double and became out of reach on points. The title went to Scheckter. Perhaps Jody's car wasn't always the fastest on the track, but the South African again, like Lauda 2 years ago, outplayed his rivals due to stability. Gilles Villeneuve perhaps could have competed with a teammate if he hadn't made several mistakes. In just 3 years, the use of internal aerodynamics has become a primary recipe for success in F1. It would seem that another novelty engine with a turbocharger wasn't so widespread. Not a single engine manufacturer dared to follow the example of Renault. In addition, for the entire season, the driver of the French team only once climbed to the top step of the podium. Jean-Pierre Jabay won the home race in Dijon in every sense. But the results of the qualification demonstrated as clearly as possible that the future of F1 is with turbo engines. Champions from Ferrari started from pole position only twice. Williams drivers 3 times. 4 times it was possible for representatives of Ligier. And yellow French car started the race from the first position 6 times.